that no man on earth could live up to it. It seemed inevitable that one day he would incur the wrath of the emperor, denouncing the whole world by his strong and fervent words. This was the place Saul wanted to see the most. His father was a Pharisee, one of the defenders of the Mosaic law. Strict in life, strict in living. So his grandfather before him, and Saul wanted to be a Pharisee. But there was also a name that he had heard so often, spoken with great reverence and admiration. And that was the name of a teacher who held forth there in Jerusalem. His name was Hillel, and he had lived to be 100 years old. His son had sat at his feet. Hillel had only recently died. Saul knew this, but he wanted to see the place where he had taught. And he went there to watch and to hear the son Simon hold forth on the teachings, the deepest understandings of the law of Moses. And beside Simon was his son, whose name was Gamaliel. And Saul listened with great intent. Would Simon be alive long enough for when he reached around 22 or 24 to be able to go to Jerusalem and live there and study under the great Simon, son of Hillel, or the great grandson of Hillel, whose name is Gamaliel? But there was something else that he noticed, and that was that there was another cloister, an enclave, right beside that one. And there were many students gathered around listening to these men teach. The man who had been a contemporary of Hillel was a man by the name of Shammai. And he was a competing teacher with Hillel. And his father reached down and said, both of them had names their students had given them. Shammai was called the binder. He was so strict. And the other was Hillel, who was called the looser, because you could get loose from the teachings of the binder, whereas the binder gave you no room whatsoever. He called a Mosaic law so strict that no man on earth could live up to it. Saul looked to one cloister and then to the other, and he noticed young men his own age standing in the crowd, staring at the cloister that had once been theirs of Hillel, and the cloister which had also at one time been the place of teaching for Shammai. He took note of those young people and wondered if he might see them someday when they were his own age. He need not have wondered. He had not need to wonder at all. So it was after the Passover that the trip back to Tarsus was repeated all over again. Paul had come back home, there to ply his skill as one who made Cilician cloth and Cilician tents. He knew that if he ever gained the complete skill of a tent maker, it mattered not where he lived in the world. If he put up a simple little sign that said Cilician or Tarsus tent maker, he would be sought after above any other kind of tent maker or tent repairer in any city, anywhere. And then something very interesting took place as Paul watched the years pass, constantly attending to the synagogue, always carrying his tefillah, growing in wisdom, growing in legalism, growing in law, growing obedience to others who had come before him in their interpretations of the law. But when he was 18 years old, with plans of coming to live in Jerusalem spinning his head, he began to hear something. It was news that would always spread from one synagogue to another, from one city to another, one nation to another. In fact, the marketplace for both Gentile and Jew was a place to get news virtually every day. There was always someone coming in with information. There was always a place to either speak it or to have someone write it on the wall. That was the center place of receiving news. But most of that news was news concerning the emperor and things that had to do with the city of Rome. It was also true that the only thing that you would receive there that was official was good tidings and good news about the emperor himself. But the whispers that went with it were always more interesting than the news. On this occasion, some men had come from Israel and were talking about some very strange events taking place, not in Jerusalem, nor Damascus, nor Caesarea, nor any of the other cities, but were taking place in the desert. Saul was 18 years old. The year was 26. The year 26. It was an interesting year, to say the very least. Tiberius had been ruling from the palace in Rome, but he had grown more sullen, more darker in his mood. He had developed complete paranoia, thinking that just about anyone out there was plotting to kill him. He also decided in that year that he would move out of the city of Rome. The palace there on Palatine Hill had been there for centuries, but it was also located in the filthiest, noisiest single spot on this entire earth. Yes, a place where people literally died from lack of sleep because of the noise. The emperor himself also had a villa outside the city, usually stationed not too far away from the peaceful cemeteries where people leaving on holidays would come to those cemeteries and have outings and lunch, noontime, and dinner together there among the quiet hills and the stones and the urns and the tombs. But this time, Tiberius would do more than that. He decided to move out of the city of Rome entirely. He would go to the island of Capri, out in the waters just off the coast of Naples. It was an interesting island. It had been given over to the wealthy to come there for leisure times, but now it was becoming the possession of the emperor himself. Beautiful, well kept, but the end of one end of the island was a cliff. They said was 1,000 feet high. At least it was very high. And he intended, this Tiberius, to make good use of it. So it was in the year 26 that he turned over the taking of messages and giving an alter ego to a man named Sejanus, who would take care of Rome when Tiberius was out of the city. Although Tiberius would come on rare occasions to the Senate to speak, usually in a few words, and then leave. No one wondered how Sejanus would end up. Foolish man. It seemed inevitable that one day he would incur the wrath of the emperor. And let this be known. What the emperor loved, the empire loved. What the emperor did not like, the empire did not like. And that which the emperor hated, the entire empire would make life miserable for such one or ones. It was for that reason the Jews had been so concerned about Tiberius. At the age of 18, nothing had taken place in the life of Tiberius that had caused the Jews to feel threatened. There were three sections to this land of Israel. Galilee was ruled by a tetrarch whose name was son of Herod, and he was the man whom Jesus would one day call the fox. His name was Antipas, Herod Antipas. Israel, Judea, had been ruled for a short time by one of the sons of Herod, but Judah was a restless place. And in the year 26 AD, someone took over, who was a military man, the governorship of Judea. Now, let it be understood that some men in some provinces carried the name king, some of them proconsul, and some of them were simply referred to as governors. But if you belong to a not yet pacified province, chances are certain that you would be ruled by a procurator, a governor by the title of procurator. as over against proconsul. Now all of the pacified provinces of all the Roman Empire were ruled over by the Senate, but those which were troublemaking provinces were ruled over by the emperor himself and to the hands of his procurators. Now, the procurators and the governors and the tectarchs and those who carried the name king but were not, all 104 of them had to write an extensive letter of what had happened in the last 7 days to the emperor himself. Every week, 104 men. Now, the new procurator, Pontius Pilate by name, arrived in Judea, being a harsh, rough, and sometimes even cruel, sometimes even disastrous ruler. He decided to quell and break the will of the Hebrew people immediately. He had no more come by ship, docked in the harbor of Caesarea by the sea, taken his place in the palace, which also had a jail beneath it, a prison. A few days after his arrival, the Jewish people in Caesarea and in Jerusalem woke up to find that during the night there had been placed something called standards all over the city, both in Caesarea and Jerusalem. Now these were, by Jewish minds, heathen flags intended to promote heathenism and did not belong in Jerusalem and should not be in Caesarea. Remember these words, that the population of Caesarea by the sea was 50% Jewish and 50% Gentile, 50% heathen and 50% of it Jewish. The Jews of Caesarea immediately asked for an audience with the governor and received it, in which they implored him to remove the standards. He said they would stay. For a Jew, this was blasphemy, and in Jerusalem, even worse. And so a delegation from different parts of Judea asked for another audience for the governor. Rather than giving it to him, he made a plot. He would receive the Jews in a room filled with Roman soldiers. At a given point, he would tell them if they did not immediately leave his room with their foolish requests, they would all have their heads cut off. And all the soldiers instantly would pull out this Roman sword. And so the Jews came in and implored Pontius Pilate to please remove the standards. He immediately made his declaration. The swords came out from the fist of every Roman soldier in the room, and expecting the people to scream and leave in fear, all of the Jews fell on their faces before the feet of Pontius Pilate and pulled back their hair, exposing their necks, inviting death. Pontius Pilate had underestimated the monotheistic Hebrews. Horrified and remembering that he had a letter to write to the emperor, and knowing that he dare not slaughter in his first week a large number of Jewish leaders, he gave in. And the next day the standards were all removed. But he would wait his revenge. And he would wait his revenge. The year was 26 AD. But there was something else that happened besides Tiberius moving out of Rome to Capri. And from Pontius Pilate coming into Jerusalem and Caesarea and being met by devout Jews willing to die with their heads severed to have those pagan symbols removed. And what it was this. It was a very strange looking man who had appeared out of nowhere. The hair of camels had been turned to threads and woven into a garment. It was an unclean animal. And it was rumored that he ate locusts, which was also considered unclean, and ate wild honey as his food. His hair had never been cut. His eyes were as black as coal, as was his hair, which reached almost to the ground. And instead of coming into the cities to proclaim the word of God, he began preaching where caravans crossed in their paths and began to denouncing the whole world by his strong and fervent words out there in the desert. And the people had to come to John rather than John coming to them. Sometimes he was in the wilderness in Judea and crowds came. And there were times that he was on near the Jordan River and the crowds came in Galilee. And sometimes he crossed the Jordan River and baptized on the other side of Jordan, a word that hardly fell freely from the mouth of any devout Jew. Beyond the Jordan was beyond Israel. And it said that he thundered against sin, that he thundered by name against some, and he also announced that the kingdom of heaven was very, very near. His words were correct, for he was. Yes, the kingdom, he was very near. And in 18, at every opportunity he got, he learned all he could of what this almost insane-looking madman was saying. He was announcing the coming of the Messiah, and he was calling out that he himself was nothing but a cry out in the Judean wilderness. And so did he listen, and so did he plan and wait for the passing of years until the day he could leave home and go to Judea, perhaps meet this strange prophet, and to sit at the feet of Simon or Gamaliel until he would reach the age of somewhere between 20, 22, or 24. He had even found some of his kinsmen who agreed to let him live with them. In fact, they had looked forward to his coming. In fact, their names were Andromeda and Julian.
Was your heart stirred toward deeper intimacy with Christ? Share how this message impacted you in the comments below.